Yes, hi. Yeah, that's actually true. My father had to go like 5 or 6 times to that social service, and they didn't find anything, so there we go. So we're here to talk a little bit about UX, and it's really cool to be at a front-end conference, being really invited to do that. That's awesome. And I want actually to pitch something to you today. I want to pitch to you to get involved in UX work, although you might think you're a developer. And the 3 parts to this is that UX is really work. Like your job, it does involve creativity and inspiration and stuff, but it's mostly normal work. The myth of the lonely designer staring at Photoshop for a couple of weeks and then coming up with this super, very well functioning, high polished thing, it's just that it's a myth. And it's actually quite easy to get started. So this talk will not make you a UX designer as little as a talk like front-end from scratch would make me a front-end developer. And the level we're looking at it will be like, okay, there are package managers and frameworks are a thing, and the browser only understands JavaScript and not Python and stuff like that, so we will take this bird's eye view. And after then, it should be pretty easy to do your first things and get used to it. But most importantly, you can do it. It's not a special thing. It's not something that requires more talent than any other job that's complicated, as development, for example, is. So I'm currently working as a UX/interaction/product designer. We just redefined that role a little bit at Jimdo, where I work. And already at this point, thanks for helping out with the conference. That's really awesome to do. I have done a lot of community work in the past, like some of the other speakers too. So for example, I kicked off the UX camp in Hamburg, which is still growing slowly every year. Then I became a dad of twins. They are now 4, so we're out of the worst, but the first 3 years are terrifying. I can say so much. So I started looking at how I can spend my free time with projects that don't do any dependencies or having hard deadlines. So for example, I developed my own sketching workshop with the beginning of the year and have done 2 tests this year and will probably continue to do that. And I love code. I have always worked in code. I think I wrote my first HTML stuff in 2001 or 2002, and in the past years was one of those people who are like doing the design and the interaction stuff and also writing production code, mostly CSS and HTML, of course. So we want to take like this bird's eye view and see how stuff is connected, and that bears at first the question, what is that thing with UX at all? What is UX? And if you have never typed that into Google, I can totally recommend doing that and, I don't know, reading the first 2 pages of results or something, because everybody has their own definition. But I found something for myself that last year that is also kind of terrifying, but is also kind of true. User experience is what is happening between the clicks. Because until a user is interacting with your interface, they are probably looking at the view, they are getting information in, and they are wondering if that is actually what they were looking for example, which often kinds of lead to high levels of frustration if you ever have attended a user test, for example. And one of my favorite quotes is this: a user interface is good if it does what the user expected it to do. Well, how are we supposed to know what the user is expecting? Or does that mean that UX is actually more about expectation management? A great hashtag, I think, for that. Now, the quote is actually by Joe Spowski, which you might know from the Joel test, co-founder of Stack Overflow and Trello and stuff like it. But he also wrote this super awesome book, beginning, I think 2001 it came out, User Interface Design for Programmers. It is back in print with another cover, and of course the examples are kind of outdated. For example, the Windows 98 indexing wizard, for those who remember examples like that. But of course the abstractions are totally valid until today. So the user interface is what we can actually deploy, and UX is kind of an umbrella term for a lot of different disciplines. So from the hip, I usually use these. So you're doing research and analysis to find out what works and what doesn't. You come up with ideas in the conception phase. You're doing information architecture, for example, deciding where things go in the menu and if users are finding it, where they expected it. You're doing interaction design to define the flow and what elements are where and why and how many of them. And then motion design and visual design make it pop and blink, of course. And I want to introduce 2 terms that are helping me a lot to to get into the stuff, and that's motivation and friction. So motivation is what the user is bringing, a job they have to do or a goal they want to achieve. And there are different things. I don't know, a game is hopefully very fun. If you think of a software that's helping you to do your tax returns, that's more like a, can we please get over with goal? But they are motivated to do it. It would still be a lot harder to do without the software. And then your app probably introduces some friction at some point, or even a simple web page where the text is too small or something like that. So in short, motivation is good and friction is bad. And how can we influence those two things? Now, if you Google motivation and friction in the context of user experience, you will find this image. And I don't want to bash it too much. I just never understood it. I mean, that's one axis, but it's a two-dimensional graph. And all these arrows, I don't really get it. But I always like these two terms, so what can we do with it? We can build kind of an index of that. So if our experience is motivation divided by friction, then that means that everything above 1 is good and everything below 1 is bad. If the friction is higher than your motivation to continue, then that's the point where people drop out of a flow. And we're usually measuring all that in a checkout funnel, but not that often in your usual app flows. And at any point in time, you can then check the x if it's below 1 or above 1, and you can make another graph out of that. And I marked the 1 a little bit, so there are 2 harsh drops, and usually users would have probably just stopped. So you can only find out if the rest of the flow is working if you do a so-called moderated usability study. I will get into that later. Because only then you can help them get over the hurdle where they would have usually dropped out. This is a customer journey map. So this is kind of the super professional, high-level thing, and you see it's a huge sheet with a lot of stuff to fill out. And you see it's from nngroup.com. So Jakob Nielsen is one of the, 5 or maybe 6 people who are pushing this whole topic and trying to be as scientific about it as possible since the 90s. An endless repository of knowledge in that area. And we want to continue to focus on that graph. And I wanted to come up with an example that's not software, because we're doing that every day, but something that still everybody here can understand. So I chose attending a conference. Not this one, but another one. So this is the graph of a conference that I personally attended. And you see that at the beginning, it's below 1. That's where I had to get up out of bed in the morning. So that didn't go very well. Now you could say, well, getting out of bed is not part of the product. But from a user point of view, it's totally part of the whole experience of that day. So, well, I finally managed to get up, then I got ready, and let me try this laser pointy thing here. So here it's going up. I could go by train a little bit to the conference. I love going by train, so that's good. Then it's dropping right here, and that's the line at the registering. But of course, I need to get through registering. So a couple of cool talks, then it drops again. Because the line at lunch is so long that I nearly left the location to get lunch somewhere else and might have missed some of the talks. A couple of other great talks, and then what happened here? Well, after the last talk is over and before the party starts, I decided to take a little walk. And suddenly I found myself in an area of the city that I don't know, where it's mostly dark, no people or shops out there, and the battery of my phone is dead. What do I do now? Well, I keep wandering a little bit around and then actually meet somebody who is on their way to that conference party. So, woo, my motivation goes up, the friction is away, and I can continue to go to the party. That's kind of my journey for that day. And this is a good point to introduce a classic format that I also think most of you know, the classic user story format. For those who don't know, as a user, we say usually, but it can be all kinds of roles. I want to do something in order to achieve something or in order to get some kind of value. So in this case, as an attendee, I want to arrive on my seat at the conference before the first talk to not miss anything. So in order to achieve that, I have to do a lot of tiny subtasks, and I collected some of them here. As mentioned, I have to get up in the morning. Maybe I have a dog and need to walk it. If I'm coming from another city, I might want to leave my luggage at the front desk so I don't have that with me. all the time. Showering definitely makes every day better, but we still might to ask, are all of these tasks equally important? And they are not. You can mark the ones that are really essential to get the experience of seeing the first talk on time. As mentioned, showering makes the day better for everyone, just for yourself, but essentially you could leave it out in order to see the first talk. Maybe you could also outsource walking the dog to a neighbor and stuff like that. Now we have our essential talks and we can put them in order. So these are the 4 things in the order that you have to do them. And the order is really important here. You can change the order of these tasks. And then we can group the other stuff below it. So if you think about getting ready in the morning to leave the house, you can say that these are different resolutions or different qualities of that task. So basically getting up in the clothes you, I don't know, fell asleep yesterday, leaving the house is possible, but the quality gets better when you shower, when you have breakfast, when you have time to get a coffee, and so forth. And this is usually what we define as an MVP, the minimum viable thing in order to achieve the value that you're trying to have. What we just did, we used a method that is called user story mapping. And a guy named Jeff Patton, last year, I think, finally, so to speak, he said that himself, released this book. And I think it's one of the most important books written in the past years. The method itself is really quickly explained, more or less. We did that. He's using more or less the same example in the book. And after 2 chapters, the book continues to just go into sane ways of working together, so to speak. This is an example of a user story map that we did in December for a feature that we started to implement. We had 4 weeks with 3 people, and I'll tell you later more about it. But what you can see here is these diamond-shaped things are kind of the high-level tasks or areas that we want to go, and then we group the user stories below that, and we made this kind of dotted line here, and that's so-called cutting a release, so the minimum viable version that we want to finish in the given time. And I said the order is really important, and this is where user experience can suddenly go very much into planning, or at least this method. Because if you start to implement the getting up part, and then you implement the taking a seat part, then you have 2 user stories that are not connected, and your flow is broken. You can test that, you can verify that it is actually working. So you always want to implement stories that are next to one another. You might want to start still at taking a seat, but after that you should probably implement the register part. Let's combine the customer journey with our user stories. So again, another graph. And then here that's basically the part of the larger graph that I showed you earlier. I had to get up, went by bike to the location, had to register, and so forth. So I talked about that. If you have points where users are dropping out of the flow, that you have to do a so-called moderated test. And it's not that hard to get into as people always think. It's basically making up a couple tasks, then giving the task to somebody who's not involved in the product and watching them do it. And you're not allowed to help them until they drop out. And this is the first thing that pops up at Google and a couple other search engines. And this is not so much a how-to, but more just in one blog article explaining the ups and downs and the myths that are revolving around a bit. If you add in how to do it in the Google search or a DIY, then you will find some concrete steps how to do the first thing. And you don't have to do that with users at first. That's making it much easier. Just anybody from your own company that's not working directly on the product can be a test candidate for an in-house test. I don't know, the people from marketing or somebody sitting at the front desk, something like that. How many of these tests should you make? That's a very simple answer, 5. Finally, something very specific, why 5? Well, if we look again at Jakob Nielsen, they, over the decades, did a lot of tests, sometimes doing hundreds of tests for a specific thing, and they found out that roughly at 5, you're ending up at 80% of all the usability bugs. And 80% sounds like, okay, let's stop finding out more bugs, let's start fixing them, and then do another test and see if this at least worked. Okay, that was all a little bit more on the research, abstract, planning side, but we haven't yet talked about how to, make UX deliverables, so to speak, how to get working, how to collaborate on stuff. And I want to propose a tool that's a little bit under the radar for this, but most of us have it, and that tool is Keynote. So during the past 10 years, I don't know the exact number, but I guess around 70 or 80% of developers are working on Macs, and probably 99% of all the designers are using Macs. So all of us have this tool, no special thing to learn. And Keynote is really kind of a Swiss Army knife. You can do all kinds of great things about it. In the end, it has a linear flow, as we just saw that we need for UX stuff, and it has all kinds of visual tools because people want to design great slides with it. For example, sometimes you want to screenshot an existing flow and just go through the whole app and see all the steps that users are taking. Now you can save all those screenshots to your computer. Then you have a bunch of files that you need to name and you need to keep in order, and then you make a zip archive or something, I don't know. Instead, you can paste them all on slides. So you're keeping the flow, you can export in PDF and send that around, and you can then add a layer of annotations around it and ideas. But you can actually use Keynote for a lot of other things. For example, for wireframing. And sometimes people wonder what is the difference between a wireframe and a sketch. And I came up a little bit with this. So wireframing is proportionally correct spatial arrangement. So that means that the proportions in which things are on the page are actually meaning something. It should give you an idea of how large stuff actually is in comparison to the other things. How much text is fitting into a box and things like that. And this is an example of a set of wireframes I did for a thing last year where we tried to change the shop module editor. And as you can see in the left pane, there are a lot of these wireframes. And if you see that blue bubble there, you can set hotspots in Keynote. So I wouldn't usually recommend to test the wireframe with users as little as paper prototypes or something. It's way too abstract. But as documentation, this is pretty cool because developers can click through it and see what is supposed to happen when. And if you think, I'm crazy for using Keynote for wireframes, there are people who are a lot more crazy than me. So this is the Keynote Kung Fu site. This is a UI template that you can use. But if you dig around a little bit on that site, you will find the Keynote Kung Fu Black Belt, which is a 300 slide deck going into all the nitty-gritty details, and not just for wireframes, but also for high-fidelity click dummies. And there are even articles from Google Ventures, I think, who have done high-fidelity click dummies and did user testing with us. This is the example that I mentioned earlier when we saw the user story map with all the post-its. So this is as high fidelity as we could get in 2 days. We started pretty much from nothing except with some research and started sketching on the whiteboard. It was me, front-end developer, and somebody who was usually doing system administration. So a bit of a weird setup, but all three of us stared at the screen for 2 days, and at the end of day 2, we were ready with a prototype. And on day 3, we did such an in-house test as I just mentioned. So this is actually somebody who is working on the product, who is currently being tested, so to speak, in the middle. But we mixed that up a little bit. We did 5 tests as that day. So I think 3 people who are not involved in product development to just get a feel for if the prototype works, and 2 were actually designers to get feedback on the interaction and the integration into the product. So now we look at a couple of deliverables or artifacts that you can build, but it bears the question, when do you make which one of them and why? So let's make another graph, right? Let's compare the fidelity of a deliverable or an artifact to the cost. And this looks something like this. A click dummy is really elaborate to make in comparison to a simple sketch. And because I don't just mean that it takes 2 days or with 3 people compared to 2 minutes, but also that you have to have a lot of special knowledge. So you need to have knowledge about interaction design, a little bit at least about visual design, and you have to know the tool that you're building it with. A sketch, on the other hand, takes just a pen, a piece of paper, and probably 1 minute. Now, if you compare the click dummy to implemented production code, it's still really cheap and really fast to make. Just in comparison to the other artifacts, this is the most expensive artifact that you can do. So I talk now about artifacts and deliverables and what is really the difference here and when do you need what. In my personal opinion, an artifact is something that you build to get feedback so you can communicate and continue to collaborate. But a deliverable is something that you can actually sell. And if you look in the agency world, for example, then wireframes are a greatly produced deliverable. In large-scale projects, it's totally normal that one company is doing the wireframes, then they hand it over to a design shop who is like painting it really well, and then it goes into implementation, and everybody realizes they forgot to think about how stuff is really behaving and how people are supposed to interact with it. So in a normal app product, so to speak, our real deliverable is the user interface, as I mentioned before, that we can deploy. So code that the user can interpret, like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and other kinds of file types, like images, that we need to build the UI. Now, I mentioned before that sketching is really cheap and fast, and in the past, like 2 or 3 years, as I said with the workshop, for example, I've really gotten into it, what a central tool that is to communicate better, and only then you avoid misconceptions and misunderstanding. Sketching is really easy to do, it's easy to get into, and literally everyone here can do it. I guess most of you know, who knows this? Who has seen this before? Yeah, I thought so. So the project cartoon, yeah, what did you want to do and what actually happened? Now what I find really interesting about this on a meta level that you only get the joke instantly because you see visualized what happened. If you had 3 columns of text here, that wouldn't really be much of a joke. And thinking about it, if the people in the project had done the visualization before implementing it and shipping it, they could have avoided all the fuck-ups that happened in their project. And there is an exercise that in the workshop I like to do live, but here I will just report about it. So you take 2 flip charts and you put 2 people in front of the flip charts, like back to back. They can see the paper of each other. And you tell them to draw a couple of things. And they can make them as large as they want and put them anywhere on the paper where they want, like a circle, a triangle, a square, a line, and a dot. And then you ask them to turn their paper around, and you usually see this. How could this happen, you know? Those 2 people got the exact same requirements document, and still they had different things in their head. And what the author of User Story Mapping, Jeff Patton, is coining this is that shared documents are not shared understanding. And in the book he goes on, he has a very nice illustration about it, that only when you actually talk about things, when you start visualizing, for example, with simple sketches to each other, what you really mean, you can synthesize the ideas and then be sure that you're actually on the same page and going towards the same goal. The other interesting thing about that exercise with the 2 flip charts is that these 5 elements are really all you ever need. And I mean not just for UI sketches, totally, but also even if you look into fine art classes or drawing classes, this is the basis that people usually start with, and then it's just like 20 or 30 years of training, you know. You can split everything up in triangles, squares, circles, lines, and dots. And then UI example is this one. I did this last year before I did an earlier, now I can say very different version of the talk, and I gave myself 90 minutes to copy the Twitter interface. So some of you might have recognized that it is Twitter's, others might not have, but at least as soon as I say Twitter, you instantly recognize everything, and it's just consisting of these very basic shapes. And now I could start to change stuff. I could do another sketch where, I don't know, the left part is on the right and the right part is on the left, and we could start to talk about why this one is better or why this one is better. So I said that oh sorry, that was one too far. I started doing a workshop, so I shortened the title. Meanwhile, it's just sketching for software. That's totally enough. And I did it one time as half a day. That was actually at UbiLabs, so thanks at this point for the location. And the other time was a whole day in Berlin. But anyways, doesn't matter if it's 4 hours or 6 hours. It consisted only of people who were saying, well, I'm not the visual type. I cannot draw a straight line if my life depended on it and stuff like it. But after a couple of hours, there was a huge wall with sketches like this. Nobody of these were a designer beforehand, and after a couple hours you can do these, and I mean, there are icons and illustrations, there are layouts and shading and colors and highlighting, and I think this is pretty terrific. Now, if it's about user interface sketches, I can also recommend Eva Lotta Lam's workshop. Eva Lotta Lam is a little bit of a rock star in that area, so she has released a couple of books of her sketch notes now in the 4th year, and this is a workshop that I, for example, went to in March to attend, and we talked, and she's currently doing full-time teaching, so you can just book that workshop for your company. It's really recommended. We did that at Jimdo, and everybody was totally up in arms about it, and it has helped to communicate, definitely. If you don't want to do some kind of workshop, if you're just about more buying a book, then I can recommend these two, either one of those. Even if your goal is currently not to start to take sketch notes at conferences or something, this book is still great to teach you the very basics and to tell you why, since you're already visually thinking, it makes sense to learn how to express it in a very simple way. Unfolding the Napkin is kind of a follow-up book to also a little bit of a famous thing in that area. The original book was on the back of the napkin. It's a little bit thick and a lot of text, so I like this one more. This is also a workbook in the real sense that you can just draw into on the train or on the bus. And by that, we actually kind of done a little bit with all the basics. So if we want to recap that a little bit, we talked about the customer journey, and we talked about how it goes together with user story mapping, and how this can help both in planning what to do and when to do it and in what order, both for designing, for implementation, and also for testing. And we talked a bit about artifacts and costs and why you would want to decide for each one of them. We learned that Keynote is a pretty terrific tool that most of us already have, and there you can start doing all the things with it. And then finally, we learned that sketching is really like a key point where we can start to talk to each other and exchange ideas and collaborate better. So, and with that, I would say to leave it up to your turn. My recommendation is to get the Sketchnote handbook, do the first couple of chapters, and then start talking to one of your designer friends. And maybe not instantly get into an argument about opinions or something, but just show them what you did, that you get into the stuff, and what they have to say about it, and if they can maybe give you some tips on how to continue and where your next entry point would probably be. I'm just seeing that a lot faster than in all the run-throughs beforehand. I'm a little bit sorry for that. So maybe I'm just ending with a huge thanks not only to you for listening to this, but also explicitly to Jimdo, because they're giving us a lot of freedom to try out stuff, like to just book workshops and try out stuff in Slack time and things like it. And this has really helped to find ways that are helping the whole team to get stuff done. Well, but I guess mostly thanks to you for listening. Thanks.